Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Joseph. Welcome to In All Seriousness, the new version of the TZM Global Podcast in English. We accomplished roughly 160 original podcast episodes over the course of the past few years, but went on hiatus for a while. And now we're back with a new format of a roundtable discussion with featured guests and dedicated subjects. If you're listening to this on a podcast distribution platform, you can also find this on YouTube in its visual form under the TZM Global YouTube channel. The Zeitgeist Movement has been around for about 10 years. It is a global sustainability advocacy group with an interest to change the economy as a root adjustment in order to change society. And that is effectively what we've been pursuing over all of these years, and you can find all information at thezeitgeistmovement.com. Today, our subject is geopolitics and the American empire, and our guests are Mike Prysner and Abby Martin of the Empire Files. Thank you guys so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
You guys have tried to take on an incredibly complicated and massive subject. In the sense of solutions, we at the Zeitgeist Movement, we try to figure out what we can do to actually change things, a conversation that not many people have. And I think when it comes to empire and the socio-geographical disease that it is, you couldn't possibly have taken on a more complicated and enduring subject. I'd like to start the standpoint of going backwards to forwards. Mm-hmm. What is it that you think underlies this consistent tendency that we've seen throughout history that forces one group to exert dominance and power over another group? How about you, Abby?
So I mean, when you talk about the economic structure, I think that is the key of looking at domination, and when you look at how you can pass borders to gain more capital, and really that's the premise of capitalism, right? And imperialism is an offshoot off of capitalism, and you see, of course, we've had empires pass, but never one as big, as dominant as the U.S. empire, as pervasive, as destructive as the empire that we see today, and gobbling up so many other nations and seizing their resources simply because of what capitalism is in its structure, to constantly have to get more resources. So I think that, in theory, I mean, that really is the basis of what the problem is, as we realize. But we could talk about how the U.S. is very unique in its form of empire, and how it got to be where it is today. I think the atomic bomb is a really good starting place of how it really asserted itself on the global stage, and the hegemony just arose from there. So it kind of was battling with a bunch of other empires at the end of World War II, and when the bomb dropped, we kind of just said, we're the imperial face of the world, and we won't stop, and we never will. And so that's what we've seen up until today, is the U.S. dominant force as the empire.
Have you read Jared Diamond's work on anthropology? What he called cultural anthropology, or some theorists call cultural anthropology. And it has to do with this unique trend, which is obvious enough, frankly, but whoever attains the best technology and weaponry first in the civilization or the planet tends to carve its path. And the atomic bomb seems to be the end of that path up until now. There hasn't been anything that, that really comes comparable to it. There's examples of Spaniards invading native cultures. Native cultures outweighed them, or outnumbered them, I should say, 10 to 100 to 1, actually. And they had guns, the Spaniards did. The natives didn't, in complete massacre. So there's something to be said about the role of technology in a negative sense. When we have this capital accumulating power neuroses that is a defining feature of empire. And it makes us really wonder where we're going to end up. So there's a collision course, and I think the movement talks about that a lot. There's a trajectory that's combining now where we have two different paths. You can try to find unity, or you can try and do what we're seeing now, which is regression, and that's exert dominance power over groups once again, which clearly isn't going to work. What are your thoughts, Mike?
I think it's accepted that capitalism requires growth and expansion for it to be able to survive. And so in the early days of capitalism, that meant capitalist powers, or developing capitalist powers, spreading out to get new resources, new raw materials, and things like that. But what happens when all of the major capitalist powers have expanded as far as they can expand and start bumping into each other? And that's where you get World War I. Yeah. World War II is the same thing. These were wars over redivision of the globe for the ruling class powers and their, in their respective countries. Yeah. And so I think, as Abby pointed out, and then World War II marked a completely new era in the world where the United States emerged. Every other capitalist country was and developed country was completely decimated by the war. The U.S. is relatively untouched, but also, came out completely on top militarily. All its former foes, it resurrected them, like Japan and others, to fall in line behind it as its junior partners, with them in the lead. And since then, we can for sure, just looking at military interventions, wars, expansion of bases, coups, things like that, the U.S. has been on a really full charge towards, trying to dominate the entire globe. Of course, we've seen that, backfire in many ways, but yeah, that's the overall situation we're living in, is that this system requires expansion and that it inevitably leads to war.
Exactly. Absolutely.
I just want to draw the distinction, we kind of raised the issue, is it human nature then to fall into empires and want to expand? And I think some of the empires of the past, you could say as a commonality was some scarcity. They wanted, as their populations expanded, they wanted to expand territory. As Mike pointed out, the wars really of the last 200, 300 years have been all at the behest of the wealthy class, as a form of population control, or as a means to enrich the coffers of the very, very wealthy, or in some cases almost sport. In World War I, the distinguished wealthy aristocratic classes actually showed up on the sidelines to watch the war. They thought it was all going to be over in a week, and this was the first introduction of mechanized warfare. They were horrified by what it was produced, but it was an event. It was sport for them. And so the modern wars are not fought out of some human need. They're fought out of some need on the part of a very wealthy elite.
Sure.
Yeah, and you look at World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed, I think, in 1916, and by the UK and France, and they really just drew a line through the Middle East and divided all of these completely complex countries into just sectarian lines, and I just can't conceive of what would the Middle East look like today if these empires didn't just arbitrarily draw a line and just say, that's your piece and this is my piece. And you go back to the Berlin Conference, it was the same thing drawn up to divide Africa, and everything that's arisen today out of essentially empires dividing the globe. It's pretty sick. And then, of course, NATO has just emboldened the U.S. power to be able to carry out all of this warfare with complete impunity.
We can touch upon that evolution. I wanted to also make a comment regarding the kind of cultural hegemony, the things that we're taught as American school children about what empire means and the Good Samaritan empire that the United States is, and how it, it's the policeman of the earth, but necessarily so, that American exceptionalism. And there was one quote in regard to colonization that goes back to 1923, and I thought it was an excellent thing, especially since you brought up Africa. And it's by Albert Sarraut, who was the Secretary of State, French Secretary of State. And he states in 1923, "What is the use of painting the truth? At the start, colonization was not an act of civilization, nor was it a desire to civilize. It was an act of force motivated by interests, an episode in the vital competition which, from man to man, from group to group, has gone on ever increasing. The people who set out to seize colonies in distant lands were thinking primarily of themselves and were working for their own profits and conquering for their own power. The origin of colonization is nothing else than the enterprise of individual interests, a one-sided and egotistical imposition of the strong upon the weak." And I think that summarizes in and puts into focus this exceptional nonsense. Like, did you ever, Summer here, what was your impression of America when you grew up in this exceptional, especially in the kind of mid to late 20th century, where the peak of U.S. abundance and all of the violence that had hoarded everything in. People forget that the poor of the world are poor because they've been robbed. They haven't been left behind by capitalism.
They haven't worked hard enough.
Right.
Yeah, I grew up in the late 90s, early 2000s when the economy was booming, and we had guests, veterans come to speak to us at our school about how necessary war was and why it was important. And a lot of us had questions like, well, why during a war do we see America going into other countries and bombing the civilians there, but the same thing doesn't happen here? That was a question I asked in second grade when we had a troop from Desert Storm come speak to our class. Whoops. And I got a week of counseling. I had to talk to puppets called No-No and Do-So the dolphin and No-No the dragon about what types of questions and how to behave and what's appropriate in a classroom.
Wow.
Very effective, I see.
Wow, that's incredible.
They got to you.
Wow.
Yeah, so these are, even in watching cartoons as a child in
Yeah.
America, you like Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, when they have a war and they hold up the war sign,
Yep.
it's back and forth, back and forth. So I think it's,
You're right.
it's suspicious when we talk about war and it doesn't even look like the picture of war that's been painted for us in history books.
Going back a couple of years when I was growing up in the Cold War era with Reagan, and just the word communism was a 4-letter word.
Yeah.
But growing up, we just, communism is bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I'm married to a Hungarian who actually lived in communism, and she tells me about it, and it's like nothing compared to what we were
Oh, yeah.
brought up
Yeah.
Right.
thinking it was just this monster.
Yeah, it's amazing how powerful the propaganda has held. That America is good. And this goes back, of course, to Bernays in the 20th century. I mean, it's really the entire 20th century where the U.S. creates this, starting with World War I, World War II, this image of itself as the great nation that's going to save others. And Vietnam and Korea and Grenada and 2 Iraq wars haven't managed to stain that image in the minds of a lot of people who aren't necessarily paying attention or astute.
Yeah.
In the minds of Americans, however,
Yes.
when you look at the rest of the world, America is the biggest threat to their security. I mean, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
Gallup
yeah.
poll.
Yeah.
Global 66
Yeah.
countries.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. No one talks about that.
Right.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah, and I think that, that Summer's experience is really all of our experience, right?
Yep.
We grew up with a heavy indoctrination.
Yep.
And, of course, why is that? I think that we know that we have the biggest military budget ever and the biggest military, but it's really hard to wrap your head around the actual size and scale and reach of that. The size of the US military dwarfs all of the rest of the major powers combined. Like the size of the Navy, the number of military bases around there, like no other country has this vast network of bases all over the globe. We're the only ones that do it. And the amount of military spending. So all these problems we see at home, we see just endless money, trillions of dollars, immediately can be dumped into wars. But there's no money for things here.
Right.
So this is the propaganda. But what is the story that's justifying this huge military spending and also wars all over the place? It's this idea that Summer's talking about, is that we grow up thinking that all U.S. military intervention, this is about human rights and democracy, bringing it to the rest of the world. That's the story.
Yeah.
And they tell us who our enemies are, right? Our enemy is in Iraq, our enemy is in Cuba, our enemy is in Venezuela. They list who the enemies are, and they also tell us who our friends are. Our friends are Saudi Arabia, our friends are Israel, So when you really look at what the story is, that it's about human rights and democracy, if you line up who our enemies are and who our friends are, or friends of the U.S. empire, it completely contradicts that.
Yeah.
But what those things do have in common, enemies of the United States empire, what they have in common is an economy that doesn't just bow to the United States. And their friends, it doesn't matter how awful their human rights are, it doesn't matter if they're a democracy or the worst dictatorship on the planet, if they bow to U.S. economic interests, then they're okay. So really it's kind of obvious what it's all about.
Right.
Yeah, there's currently 24 fascist governments supported by the U.S. currently,
Right,
and
yeah.
many
Funding new
more.
ones,
Past,
too.
yeah.
This is just current.
The U.S. has intervened, I think, 56 times alone just in Latin America.
Oh, sure. We remember John Perkins.
Yeah.
I interviewed him years
Yep.
ago.
Great guy.
And he does an excellent job describing the economic hitman, the covert features of economic negotiation that start off with negotiation, then lead to assassinations, and eventually coups, then assassinations, and then eventually wars.
And under Obama, I think our special forces expanded. He was bombing 6 predominantly Muslim countries, if not 7, and then special forces expanded to 70% of the world's countries, and then military personnel is actually almost 100% of the world's countries when you break that down. So even though it seemed to a lot of people that he was downsizing the wars and scaling back, it really was more pervasive than ever with this mission creep.
Yeah.
And yet, Democrats get labeled as being soft on war, soft on crime, and that's one of the first things that a Democrat has to prove. Usually he or she is offered a war that they have to greenlight as a way to prove their mettle.
Didn't you see the MSNBC pundits crying with joy after Trump started bombing Syria? He finally became president. We're guided by the beauty of our
Thankfully, I
missiles.
missed
We
it.
like 'em.
Oh man, you missed it. Yeah,
MSN,
Brian.
you mean the liberal station.
Yeah, the Democrats. So
And what
war
does
is
that say-
bipartisan.
What does that say about the maturity of culture?
Right.
My God, it's that show of force. Speaking of which, I have another great quote, because I like quotes, and one of my great sociological heroes is Thorstein Veblen, someone that not too many people know about. He should be right up there with many. I'm eventually going to make a biopic on him. Here's a great quote. I apologize for his verboseness because he's very humoristic. It's about the predatory nature of society and business, as he saw it in the mid-20th century. As the predatory culture reaches a further development, there comes a distinction between employments. The honorable man must not only show capacity for predatory exploit, but he must also avoid entanglement with occupations that do not involve exploit. The tame employments that involve no obvious destruction of life or no spectacular coercion of refractory antagonists fall into disrepute and are relegated to those members of the community who are defective in their predatory capacity. That is to say, those who are lacking massiveness, agility, and ferocity. Therefore, the able-bodied barbarian of the predatory culture, who is mindful of his good name, puts in his time in the manly arts of war and devotes his talents to devising ways and means of disturbing the peace. That way lies honor. It's so true, though. What is going on in the culture that seems to fawn over the dominance of others? And it seems to be getting worse in this current phase that we're in. You know,
I actually have a question for Abby and for Michael. You guys have been in Venezuela, you've been in Iraq, you've been in Palestine, Israel, you've been here. While all this is happening, you've talked to civilians. What are their perspective on Americans, just the populace?
Yeah.
Do they have opinions about the general population aside from our government? How do they feel about that?
Well, it seems like Americans are unique in the sense that we externalize all of our problems. We don't actually see anything that our policies do affecting us, yet we hate, we believe the propaganda, and so we automatically think that all the people of Iran are our enemies, all the people of North Korea are our enemies, Iraqis are our enemies. When you go to these other countries, like in Palestine, I went into a candy shop and this guy was just like, "Where are you from?" And I was like, "I'm American." He was like, "I love America." I was like, "Why would you love us? Why? We are funding your subjugation and misery." But you realize that in almost every other country, people can completely remove the criminal actions of your government to the people, and they really don't blame you for what your government's doing. And it's kind of this astuteness that I feel like Americans are lacking in their naivete about global affairs. What is your sense, Mike?
Yeah, that's the experience I've had too. I think that, for us living in the U.S. empire, we have this privilege of not having to see the world as someone subjugated by an empire, but all these places we visited are places that their entire daily life and existence is completely dominated in the misery and suffering, because of the United States and the things that the United States has imposed on them. So there's a high degree of political consciousness in all the places that are most affected by the United States. And so that's been our experience, is that we don't need to explain anything to anyone about, it's not our fault as the U.S. government. It's like that's kind of well established and known. And so, it's encouraging. I think that's why international solidarity is important. Like going to the Gaza Strip in the wake of the massacre in Gaza in 2009, going to other similar combat zones, that having actions here and showing solidarity with people who are under attack from our government has a major impact and is extremely appreciated and is gives so much more energy to those people who are having to live with those things. And so I think that's, something people should remember. It's an important thing that, we need to build, because it's not just about fighting here. It's about recognizing that the struggle is connected with everyone else in the globe who's fighting a similar enemy, same enemy.
You mentioned global consciousness, and that's a big difference to today versus in the past. When there were an invading troop coming into your land, the Hittites had come to take your wheat or so forth. They were the enemy. You had no knowledge of them. You didn't speak their language, et cetera, et cetera. Now we all have tremendous language and connection and cultural connections. The world has become more unified, the internet obviously, and I think that the Zeitgeist Movement is at the heart of that, where, hey, wait a minute, we as a population are waking up and saying, we can collectively choose to do this better. We are the adults in the room. Let's go about this in a rational way, not following this sort of irrational policy of good versus evil, them versus us. And we have to transition out. And increasingly, with climate change and the various things that are going on, it's going to be that or extermination.
Yeah, it's not just about civilians either. The Pentagon's the biggest polluter on the planet, hands down. And so when you talk about climate change, it's kind of a joke.
Sure.
When we're living in an empire that has complete callous disregard for the environment, and the Navy's doing exercises all the time in the ocean with quadrillion billion particles of plastic just polluting the shit out of the entire world. So it's disgusting.
It is.
Yeah, and it's, this real toxic enemy we have in the United States, which is nationalism, right? And it's just like indoctrinating people like we have some kind of common interest. Everyone who lives in America, in the United States, we're in common cause together, rich and poor. And that people in other countries, they're another nation. Nationalism is for us. But I think that, like I'm a veteran of the Iraq War, and like the experience of knowing, so many people in Iraq who then became anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist from that experience, it's because of shedding that nationalism, of saying, okay, like I'm in Iraq, and I see people have a hard life here, and I grew up having a hard life. That's why I joined the military. I feel like I have a lot in common with these people, but who I don't have anything in common with is like millionaires like George Bush and Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, who are telling us that we have to go here for our common interests of our nation. And so I think that it's easy for that veil to come off, shedding that nationalism, this like patriotic BS, and embracing like, internationalism.
Yeah, but I'm curious of how many of the grunts that you were dealing with back in the day have this sort of open perspective that you do, and how many of them are like, ooh, gung-ho, hoo-ha for America?
Oh, quite a lot, are gung-ho. Lots of masculinity issues and things like that in this country.
Keep in mind, the brain doesn't fully mature until 25.
Yeah, man.
Wow.
Putting these kids in at like 18, 19.
I was interacting with people 17.
Yeah,
That's true, good point.
They don't have judgment, and I think the people in the psychology departments of the military and Pentagon know this.
Yeah, but it's
8 years.
but every single imperialist war or colonial war, in that is a history of soldiers' rebellion and resistance to it. So Vietnam War, World War I, World War II. I mean, there's always stories of thousands of soldiers realizing it, and then becoming active fighters against it. So that's something encouraging.
I wanted to actually ask you about your experience with that and what trajectory you had when you moved from being for the war to against it. Like, what was it that really set you off?
Yeah, I mean, I was just one of, like everyone else who joins the military. I went to Iraq when I was 19. It was like a lifelong dream. I believed everything I was told about freeing the oppressed and helping those in need and spreading freedom and things like that. But it just took a couple months in Iraq to see that everything we're being told by these, rich-ass politicians were total lies, and that, what we were being made to do was, subjugate other people and hurt other people in a very obvious way that was just about making more profits for, like Dick Cheney had stock in Halliburton, and we're like going to the oil field. Right? It was like so obvious to people. But so for me, it was a very similar transition that everyone went through. I mean, that like a conscience being like, I don't want to hurt people that never did anything to me because some rich guy who had everything handed to him in his life, doesn't have to do, and it's just telling me to do it. Yeah. So yeah, it was my experience, but it's also the experience of hundreds, if not thousands of others.
Yeah. Well, I remember watching in one of the episodes, I think it might have been the first episode of the Empire Files, you touch upon the pageantry and the ceremonialism and the honor and this mythology that is both half true, because obviously people like yourself, very good-willed when you went into this. It's not that people that want to fight for their country are mentally ill or something. They don't get there wanting to harm people. Probably some people do. It depends on what they're. But you're really just, the government exploits the weakness of the young, and especially those that want education or they're broke and they find other incentives to lure them in. But yet they're shrouded in this idea that there's so much honor, and then we talk about the death of those in America, and then we ignore the death tolls. I mean, what was the death toll in the very first Iraq War? It was like 66 Americans died.
From friendly fire, mostly, too.
And it was tens of thousands of Iraqis that died. And no one talks about that. So that again, it goes, this cultural hegemony is one of my fascinating interests, because until the mindset of the general public changes, what are we going to do? It's like it's ingrained in the values of people and the protectionism. And the sad thing about what we're seeing now, as you brought up, with climate change and so on, is that and in fact, there was a recent article that was written that described this in Scientific America. It talked about the global disasters and how they affect the poor disproportionately than the rich. Over the long term, though, it's not just singular things. And what's going to happen with that is you're getting an amplification of class war, and you create more vulnerability, and you create more division, and you create more fear, and you create more jingoism, more competitive values. Exactly. So that's why I think the Trump administration is symbolic of where we are now. Yeah. I mean, what was this tweet he just did of him beating up CNN? Did you see this thing? He tweeted out an animation.
That's not fascist at all. Bragging about assaulting
did you see
the press.
This, though? It was
about
cartoonish, and I just happened to see it. And the fact that a president, then again, why should we be surprised? I'm actually angry that I'm even bringing this up. But it was just so funny that there's him in a wrestling ring in WWF. Remember that? Yeah. But instead, he put a CNN logo on the head of the guy he's beating up. So Trump's beating up a CNN logo.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wrestling kind of.
And you know that his followers and the people that are so antagonistic now that have been fallen victim to the competitive group versus group mentality, which is the driving force of this, which is the driving force of fascism, the driving force of all the worst atrocities in history. You know, they applaud this kind of stuff, and it just blows my mind that we're actually in retrograde ultimately as a
Yeah,
society.
he's a perfect pinnacle of what America is. I mean, he is the true face of American empire. It's this hyper masculinity, the misogyny, the patriarchy, the corporate brand.
Born
He's
the silver spoon.
the first bona fide super brand to just essentially become president. And the reason that nothing can stick to him is because that is his brand.
Yeah.
So he is a misogynist. He's very abrasive, and so all these people are obsessing about language and it's not presidential to do this. It doesn't matter.
No.
That's why people voted for him. They're sick and tired of such just the media lying to them so much that this is actually refreshing for people to see
And I can
someone and
understand
they
that
embrace
a
it,
lot, yeah.
which is really disturbing.
He
It's
nailed
scary.
it himself when he said, I could kill somebody in the street, wouldn't lose any voters.
Exactly.
And let's also mention too entertainment and sports. You know, the military pays to be at football games. They have the color guard. They fly the planes over the thing, and so on and so forth. Psychologists have shown that one of the things that bonds people the most is singing together. Now, I'm not a huge sports guy, but when I've been to a few sports events, when people sing together and everyone's got their hand on their heart and the whole bit, you're doing the national anthem, you get chills. It's amazing when 100,000 people come together unified. So that's a very effective tool.
It's your limbic system. It's responding to the group inclusion.
That's right, and you get a little
It's
how
a
nice.
that's a big subject. The exploitation of the fact that we are group inclusive, that we're defined by each other, and we identify, and that is so deeply exploited in our society, consciously or not. I mean, I don't even know if we do have to think about it. But go on. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. You're fine. Movie and television as well. I was going to bring up the superhero movies. You were talking about this. What you said, might makes right. Essentially, the Avengers will be stronger than Thanos' forces, and that's what the movie's about. And we see this repeated in our movies. Of course, Donald Trump's famous character on The Apprentice, "You're fired."
Yeah,
it was this position of holding power.
The winner.
The winner.
Got to be the winner.
You got to be the winner, and America's a winner.
Yeah, that's right.
There's
And when the aliens invade, the Americans save the day.
Oh, remember that recent footage of the Trump administration, his family, and George Bush Jr. all singing together, holding hands? Do you guys remember that? It was disturbing. And wow, I don't remember exactly what that was for.
Oh, it's a creepy freak show.
Yeah.
And you go from administration, Democratic, Republican, it doesn't matter. There are certain topics that just do not change or even get discussed. In fact, they say, to know what's really crucial in society, understand what cannot be even brought up or debated.
That's my
And it's the military, it's the banking system, it's capitalism as a whole. No president ever that will be elected in any time in the future will be ever able to address those issues.
What better form of president for the United States than a corporate CEO? Because that's what the institution, architecture of the United States democracy was. It was a corporate hierarchy. That's why we call him a president.
Yes.
But going back to this symbology, this virtual reality that has become reality, this fiction that's become reality, there's a theorist named Franco Berardi who coined the term semio-capitalism, and it's about the evolution of capitalism beyond anything anyone ever expected as it merges with technology, where people are no longer able to differentiate between truth and fiction.
Wow.
And which explains Trump as well, because
Wow.
people just see it as their brains see it as a show. It's just a show. And it's not like people feel inclusive to their political activities anyway. People don't really think they're involved in politics. Most people have given up. They might go to a protest, they might vote, but most people have retired, especially in America, because even the poor are still doing better off than a lot of the people out there. Not to justify the wealth of America at all, or to sanctify the poor at all. But that's the thing. The complacency has been so incredibly strong.
Well, yeah, America knows how to prey. The propaganda, Bernays, going back to that, it knows how to prey specifically on the psychology of Americans, which is extremely warped. I like to call us empire babies because, no other country does this extravaganza of this dog and pony show with elections. I mean, it's just a disgrace. Yeah. Billions of dollars. It's actually reached the pinnacle where now, Democrats are throwing $50 million at a Senate race, knowing that it's in a slave state, that, it's extremely right-wing. It's just pointless. They just keep throwing shit at the wall, thinking that it's going to stick. But you look at Trump, I'm still racking my brain, how did he win? Even though I know the truth is so obvious. We live in this hyper reality, this fiction that's become reality, and we live in a reality show. I mean, he is a reality star, and that's what we love.
And hopefully it's a reality check, because he is
Right.
the exact embodiment.
Blank check.
He is a
Good one.
perfect picture of our values,
Yeah.
physically manifested
Totally.
Exactly.
in person,
Totally agree.
in views in an administration.
And if anything, we should be surprised it hasn't happened sooner.
Right.
Right.
That he is the manifestation of America right now.
I love it because, like, the Koch brothers, they made a comment it was a couple months ago. They were writing about how they're not going to be funding any of these congressmen if it doesn't go their way. Basically, it's completely overt now. Lobbying used to be this kind of thing that you say, oh, we do it, oh, it's just the nature of it. Now, boom, it's right out in the forefront. No one cares anymore.
Unreal.
Just paying everyone off.
Well, go back to Marshall McLuhan. He created the concept of the global theater.
Yes.
And that's where we're at. And
Yep.
how much has the television or even the cell phone, any kind of screen, replaced seeing it for yourself as truth? If something happens on television, I read it on the internet, okay, well, the internet, no big deal. But if it happens on television, it has a legitimacy that it never had before. It's replaced maybe seeing it to believe it as the most legitimate form of media. And you do have a lot of people who are bombarded, they're overwhelmed, they've got football and news media coming
It goes
at
back
them.
to that semio capitalism.
Yeah.
It's a very
And the
interesting
limbic
phenomenon.
response.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the group inclusion aspect is something that needs to be talked about when anyone approaches activism these days, because people are not rational.
No.
When they get involved in things that polarize them and they feel the need to identify. I mean, look at the fake news phenomenon. What an absolutely brilliant psychological drop down, denial, blinker out everything that disagrees with you.
Yeah.
Suddenly all these folks can believe whatever they want.
And because the media is uniformly against or for something, then only what Trump says is established
Just
as
pay attention to his
factual,
Twitter
right?
feed
Everything
and
else is fake news,
everything else
even
is
though
fake
you
news.
look at who even follows on Twitter, and it's like this bizarre, insular,
Oh my God.
like...
I'm
people
trolled all
who
day
are-
long by these weirdos on Twitter. I have no idea why they're. And it's
Group
stunning.
identity is more important than rational thought. Being a good member of your conservative tribe, or your liberal tribe for that matter, to be fair.
There's a Russian neuroscientist that does. I quote him in a book that I have that talks about exactly what happens. It's a dopamine reaction. When you feel that you're being rejected from your group as you identify with it, or just a group in general can be proximal.
Yep.
Then your brain just starts to say no. It's a pain response. It's an unfortunate thing that people don't talk about enough, because we have to understand that in order to figure out how to change culture.
So while the Democrats are, talking about Russia hysterically and trying to blame their abysmal loss and also the election of Trump on Russia, they negate to look at their own responsibility and accountability, of course, but also people forget to mention or analyze how much of an influence InfoWars and kind of the conspiracy culture has fed into the Trump regime, and Trump has nodded continuously to conspiracy memes, and you even see him calling for all the voter logs for all 50 states because of this bizarre conspiracy that's completely unfounded on voter fraud. But that's not it. I mean, he went on Alex Jones' show multiple times and thanked him even after the election for his help. And we're talking about a person who gets it right sometimes, right? 10 years ago was calling out both parties, was calling out the U.S. empire, was kind of staunchly anti-war in a bizarre sense, calling out inconsistencies with 9/11. And then he's led millions of people astray into now apologizing for the police state and capitalism and empire, and now kind of lackeys for Trump, where he's actually saying, I would die for Trump. And it worries me, because if someone like Alex Jones comes out on air and says, everyone go out in the streets and this is the day that we're starting the revolution, we're gonna die for Trump. I mean, it's really scary how many people he's galvanized into a completely bizarre trajectory, and how much Trump is part of that.
And as we were saying, he's like a broken clock. He's right a few times. His observations often are correct, as is some of the alt media. They'll identify the egregious acts of empire, but their conclusions, where they lead the people, who they place the blame with, is what's really scary and really off base.
And you saw during the Obama administration, InfoWars took a trajectory where it became extremely racist, where I think he followed the Drudge Report Breitbart style of aggregation and formulating these racist tropes around singular stories that you could really pull out about any group of people around the world. And now globalism, which is really a beautiful concept about international solidarity and spreading science and technology around the world, that we can reach everyone and feed everyone, and it's turned into a horribly racist trope where now immigration is horrible and bad, and going back to that xenophobic mentality of national sovereignty.
Yeah.
It's also American, particularly working class Americans, still recovering from the decline of the American empire, and most particularly from racial advances in the 60s. A lot of this goes back to the 60s. The Democrats sided and wanted to live up to the Constitution and bring the rest of the population, women, blacks, minorities, into a more equal state. Well, the poor whites that got passed still upset, and Republican politics have been playing on that for 50 years.
Yeah.
That's Bannon's whole mentality about the golden age of capitalism. He blames the demise of that on immigrants, black people, and commies.
You had a complete distrust of government and even, I would say, a suspicion of corporations. And somehow, with the election of Reagan in '80, they begin to change that. And you get Michael J. Fox's character on Family Ties or whatever the show was. You get that sort of young Republican type character who's gung-ho for empire.
It's the fear-driven in-group, out-group phenomenon once again. And it manifests in so many different ways. Conspiracy culture is probably the lowest of it all, because it's the implicit assumption that there's forces of people that are working against you. And it turns into this psychological problem. And, going back to InfoWars, it's sad to me that people can't see the exploitative element of the entire phenomenon, which feeds right into, again, this exploitative element of the entire political scene today as well, leading to the exploitative position of our entire global economy. And I think it's mind-numbing to me when you put it all together that you can't really win if you're looking to win. Everyone is out there trying to overcome some force that's groupistic as opposed to structural, which is why I'm big on structuralism.
Good point.
You go back to the start of America, people forget, and I don't mean to change the subject, it fits in. We have this romanticism about what America was when it started, with its checks and balances and so on, and some good things regarding power. But the very first presidential election, well, the first on the book presidential election, most people don't know there are numerous presidential elections before George Washington. But the one that actually happened, only 6% of the American population can vote, white property owners.
Yep.
And that isn't an architecture for. Same goes to James Madison, who talked about the creation of the Senate, which was there to preserve the opulent minority against the impecunious majority. So the entire class structure has been built into this country ever since the beginning as a carryover from Britain and monarch. And that's something, unfortunately, that people don't talk about enough either. There's that romantic, something went wrong,
Right.
And that nothing's really gone wrong. The American empire sucked in Britain after World War II. It had its infrastructure, and it started to just spread like its disease, like any empire would. If it wasn't America, it would have been someone else. It would have been some other country, as it has happened throughout time. The only difference, I think, and this kind of gets into the history of the whole phenomenon, is with technology. It was until the first industrial revolution with the steam engine that Britain was actually able to control tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of miles. And with what? They just were able to control with a small number of people using technology and to usurp governments and divide up nations. And then the U.S. just had that much more technology to do it. And now we're entering the age of digital domination, frighteningly so. And I think that's where the new wars will play out. Once you have a robotic military, and then you have strategic hacking on levels that have never been seen, who knows what's in store? It's going to be something that I don't think any of us can expect.
That's one of the questions I wanted to ask Abby about, after watching the Empire Files and all of the work that you've done on researching historical empires, have you spent any time speculating on future empires, like 100 years from now, what's going to be the empire?
I think it's what Peter's saying. Yeah, we're going into a really scary territory where now you see that the Russia allegation that's based on nothing. It's just in the ether, and there's no provability whatsoever. So it's different even than, you could do a false flag and just be like, no, this happened, and then have zero, basis or anything to really prove it.
Well, you could have an empire that isn't even territorial. You could have people with high technology doing things, dominance moves against whole establishments, banking systems, corporate empires, governments, and hold them hostage in ways never before seen. I think what's to learn from that is that this crossroad is coming, where somebody in their backyard, somebody in their basement, that's a little bit better, sounds a little better, can develop things that everyone always feared the dirty bomb. Ooh, the 1980s dirty bomb. Ooh, some terrorist would get the dirty bomb, put it in the subway. Never actually happened. But in the future, beyond that, if you think about what's happening with nanotechnology, there are some terrifying possibilities of destruction out there. Those are the two clashes that I endlessly talk about. You have the ecological pressure and you have the social destabilization. The ecological pressure will fuel the social destabilization because clearly we're not doing anything about that. And then you're going to end up with this overpopulated, scarcity-driven chaos. And that's what really terrifies me, the next generation.
Well, you brought up the key word, I think, which is population. And a lot of these...
I don't mean that in the sense that it's cumulative to the Earth, but to our social system.
To our social system, for sure.
As far as I'm concerned, genocide is in the back pocket of all the major players in government and has been for a long time, not overtly, but inadvertently, because they know that through trade agreements, they're going to continue poverty in certain regions, and they're going to have population die-offs. I guarantee you that somewhere in the bowels, especially the British Empire, you will see writings about the need and the Malthusian perspective that see people have to die, we should facilitate this death, and that's the way it's supposed to be because we can't function otherwise. And they actually think they're doing the world a service by letting 1 billion people die. Yeah.
From their perspective, as shepherds of this large flock of useless eaters who watch football and do constantly reproduce and get drunk every weekend, and we're becoming increasingly not needed. And I would even go a step further. I'd say that there's a lot of evidence of a war on people.
I think we're already there, really.
Yeah, I think we're there. We're at a war on...
The war on the poor, which has been going on literally for thousands of years, but now is ramped up in the past 200 years of the Industrial Revolution, has shown that we have machines that will replace people. We don't need to exploit them as much as we used to. We, meaning elite interests. And then with the growth of population in the third world, there's no other recourse than large wars that I think, again, in the back of the minds of folks that have worked on this, they see this as an issue of depopulation. They see this as something to just clean the slate. And it's a dark thing to talk about, and you know, most people really shy away from that kind of conversation, but that's a realistic phenomenon, I think, when it comes to empire, because I think part of empire's service in its own mind is the weeding out and cleaning and homogenizing of the world.
Of the less deserving.
Of the less deserving. And not only homogenizing in the sense of culture, obviously anyone that's brown and believes in Islam or wears weird clothes, they're clearly barbarians in the eyes of historical empire. That goes back to Britain and the civilization, bringing civilization and so on. But now it's reached a new level, and I think why? Apart from the oil in Iraq, apart from the Middle East's resources, there's some grudge. There's this white grudge or something. It's a class war, no doubt.
Yeah.
But there's something deeper than that because there's that cultural symbology, there's that cultural identification, there's the groupistic behavior, there's the idea of superiority. All of that's run through ever since recorded history. And I think that it's been so ingrained in Western culture that people are just so willing to be violent towards those that are different from them, hence this other level of neuroses. Not just economic. The economic has led to a whole new state of hatred that has a momentum in life of its own. That's just terrifying to me.
Well, and at the same time, to bring a glimmer of hope into this perspective,
Sure.
is the internet has also opened up the world, and it's made people see the faces of others and realize that they are us and have some unity.
Yeah, well, I think what Peter's saying, speaks to why we should see optimism in this situation, right? What you're talking about is a reaction to, victories around the world, right? Capitalism creates its own crises, right? So these first two world wars, World War I, World War II, were extremely devastating, horrible for the vast majority of the planet, worked out well for a small group of people, but also what happened at the conclusion of World War I and World War II. Because it was so awful, because they brought about such a crisis, there were revolutions of historic proportions. We're at the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, which, say what you want about it, but it was the first time in human history that the exploited class took power from the ruling class and ran society to meet their needs, not the needs of a small elite. World War II brought mass anti-colonial movements, national liberation movements, and so this is the legacy of crises under capitalism, is that people rebel against it and fight it and use those opportunities to fight for power and in many cases take power. And so this obsession now with the Middle East, this is when the first George Bush, President Bush, said we're going to make the new Middle East. That was saying this place that threw off the shackles of colonialism and became a bastion of anti-imperialism, we're going to undo that now that we're back on top. We're going to go back to this area that we lost and that the imperial powers lost and take it back. And so that's why they've created all this propaganda and this culture around hating the Middle East, which oil is the pivot of the modern industrial economy, so that's, of course, a big motivation. But it's every area of the globe that has stood up and said we're not going to abide by this system of a tiny elite over everyone else has been targeted for destruction.
Yeah. Yep. The post-colonialist history. It's interesting, and it makes you wonder again, the economics that underlies it is always there, but it's fruited new levels of neuroses, and that's what bothers me the most. That's what I think about the most. Sorry to keep bringing that up. Sorry to be so down on everything. But if the psychology gets to a point where it separates itself from its root origin, then how do you stop it? Because at least if you change the social structure, as I talk about, as I think is extremely important, change the economy, you could start small, you could start big, it depends on what happens. Revolution could happen in multiple different ways. But if it gets to a point where it becomes embedded in people culturally, it's going to be that much more difficult to change. It's like a racist. A racist starts out with certain impressions in youth. They have certain motivations that seem rational. They start to fornicate with other racist people, and suddenly they have a racist identity that is directly intertwined with their emotions. And that's what scares me the most, of course, about the whole economic predatory culture that we have now, this resurgence of it, in fact. You mentioned the Reagan-Thatcher administration. It's worth pointing out, what really happened in terms of this anti-government idea. What does it mean to be anti-government? It means to be anti-democracy. It means that you don't believe that people can actually function together. So So what is it? It's really a pro-corporate idea, pro-private enterprise, pro-tyranny, pro-fascist, pro-dictatorial view, because that's what business is. It is literally a top-down dictatorial structure, and you can't. What they say, it's a private enterprise and a democracy, and you have freedom. But they say that, but it's only a private enterprise when it's compared against other competing private enterprises. So therefore, they can't really control each other. They can in certain ways. But when you have this general architecture in society, and then you create this political nonsense that the state's the enemy, as in the libertarian camps and everything else, you're pretty much just saying that we believe in private dictatorial dominance, tyranny, and fascism. And that's fascinating that has actually descended upon the population. Now everyone sits there in their weird free enterprise neuroses and thinks that their slavery is freedom.
Yes, they've gotten the slaves to take up the mantle of the master. And this wasn't by accident. It just didn't happen. There were very conscious attempts on the part of the libertarians, I'll use as a general term, and I don't have any specifics to mention at this time, but to turn the people against government. Coming out of the 60s and 70s with the Great Society, Johnson and the Democrats taught the Americans, government can help you. And that's the last thing the Republicans wanted. And what they've done systematically over the last 50 years is turn everyone against government and make it fail. They've made the healthcare system fail.
It made the educational system fail. It's a judicious sabotage across anything that attempts to work in the public interest.
That's absolutely right.
Because God forbid you might be communist.
Right, and I love the whole neoliberalism and austerity has given rise to this sense that globalism and the state is even more the problem. Meanwhile, that facet has actually eradicated the last bastions of whatever a state is, and people actually think globalism, really it's capitalism. The Bannons, the Trumps who harp on this idea of the state, it really is their misunderstanding of what the core problem is.
Yeah, and they deflect people into... Government is the only institution that you can have redress. You can vote someone different in, you can protest. There are protests of corporations, but they're not nearly successful.
There's no avenue to protest.
As well attended as government protests.
Yeah, exactly. How many people have to die from a product before they even try to,
Or am I the only one bothered by we have this incredibly powerful social media owned by just a handful of corporations at a flick of a switch with no recourse. Nobody can do anything to them. They could shut down entire businesses, entire personas, entire virtual realities, because people's identities are so locked in now. But speaking of the austerity issue, not to change the subject, you guys went to Venezuela, and a long history of colonial oppression. I'm sure you know that the Chavez coup, one of the great documentaries, the
Revolution on
well, it was an amazing documentation. Everyone should watch that. But your experience seeing the echoes of this and the violence that has come forward and this just now destabilized country. What was your experience like when you guys were there?
I wanted to quickly say
sure.
what you asked me about before about empires in the future. That, I think, the social media and the algorithms online,
there we go.
there's this kind of bizarre trajectory where you don't even know that your information's confined to a certain worldview
Yes.
because they're just delivering it for you. So I think that is a really scary notion when we don't even know that we're going to be in this digital empire from these corporations.
Google filters its search engines based on country.
Yep.
And there's actually a whole book that this
Yep.
guy wrote, talked about how regional censorship basically completely limits people's understanding.
Absolutely.
And then once you get the advertising algorithms going, people just start to see things pop up around them on social media only that they would see. And suddenly all the Trump supporters, all they see are Trump supporters.
Exactly.
We could
exactly.
all Google the same exact thing.
Exactly.
Every single one of us will have
Correct.
different
Exactly.
results.
Yeah, transnational corporations are now deterritorialized. They operate beyond borders. Granted, I think 80% of them are U.S. based, which reinforces the empire. The empire gives them lots of,
Sure.
cuddling. In fact, we can go so far to argue that they pretty much are what runs the government.
That's what's so hypocritical about the Trump people being like, we hate globalism, we want national sovereignty. It's like, well, all the corporations they're all U.S. based. I mean, it all is a U.S. globalist system of capitalism.
And therein lies another bizarre, not a paradox, but contradiction where this rhetoric from the administrations about trying to it's America first, right? So we don't want to help all the UN and help all
Right.
these. Everything the U.S. has done has been strategically in its own self-interest,
Right.
either through some ploy of aid or World Bank, UN, World Trade Organization, negotiations. Everything has been in favor of the empire. And the fact that the administration, do they even know that? Because that makes me wonder, because that's like Machiavellian, reality 101. You can't be president of the United States and not have a Machiavellian sense.
It's unreal.
That goes back, it is a
But the Venezuela thing, before we went, Mike, you've been, a socialist for a long time, card carrying, and you've been a lot more sympathetic toward the Bolivarian Revolution, and you knew a lot more about Chavez and the history of this country than I did. So I was kind of going in there with a more just kind of open mind, and I didn't really know what to expect. Of course, I knew that Venezuela has been in the crosshairs of the U.S. empire for some time. I knew that the coup attempts, and I knew it was very odd back in 2014 when Obama just randomly said that Venezuela posed one of the greatest threats to the Western Hemisphere and started slapping new sanctions on it. I said, what the fuck happened? It was kind of weird. So yeah, that it was always kind of odd. And so I don't know if you want to pick up on going to the country and kind of seeing with our own eyes what you're saying before about we see the images, very curated group of images and footage specifically for a Western audience. And so when you go there and kind of see the reality, it's a very rude awakening. And even I was kind of propagandized a little bit by the media, because it's really hard, even though I've been the center of several media firestorms and used by several different entities as propaganda, I still got tricked by some of the images until you're there and really see them. Because it's really hard to grasp how uniform the media can be in a one-sided narrative. You want to believe that journalists will do their job and say like, hold on, but what about this?
Yeah, or just that the truth would leak out a little bit on the edges or something.
Yeah, and then you realize that it really is this top-down, of course there's the corporate control, and then there's also the self-censorship with a lot of these journalists where they wouldn't even be in these organizations or entities if they had an alternative perspective, or if they even would consider one.
Yeah, just a total contradiction of the way the mass media is covering this and has been since April. The depiction of the mass media is Venezuela is a dictatorship, people are starving and they're rioting because they're starving, and then the government is just massacring people in the streets who are just trying to,
Get
peacefully exercise their free speech rights. And, that was very much contradicted. I don't know if you want to
Yeah. So yeah, we hear that people are rioting in the streets for toilet paper and they're mowing down peaceful protesters. And so we went there, and what we found was that there are mass protests on both sides. So this is a country that's very heavily divided. It's on the brink of a civil war for many reasons. I mean, this is also a country that the U.S. has been funneling tens of millions of dollars into the opposition movement as well as other international entities for years, ever since 2002. So imagine how much that can embolden an organization, especially when you recycle this money on the black market and it becomes, triple or quadruple that amount. But what you realize is that there's millions of Venezuelan voices who are completely obfuscated from the Western media narrative, and that's the people who support the government. Just like in Syria, I think it's a really similar propaganda apparatus where you just simply don't hear about the people who have supported Assad. Same in Venezuela, except it's even more outrageous because this is a democratically elected socialist government who has millions of people that are supporting them. They've won, 16 out of 17 elections democratically. We're talking about a country that even Jimmy Carter, who ran the Jimmy Carter Center to observe elections, he's observed dozens all over the world, he said in 2004 that Venezuela had the freest elections in the world.
Wow.
So to go back now and say it's a totalitarian dictatorship is fucking insulting to the people who have voted and who participate in the democracy that has formulated this government today. So that was shocking. And then to see the masses out in the streets on both sides was shocking. And then you really realize that when you hear this death toll being parroted, now it's up to 90 killed by Maduro's forces. And even on the newspaper there, you hear that the press is all controlled by the state. That's not true. Just like when you hear that the entire economy is nationalized and the state controls everything, that's not true either. It's communal, private, and public, and the press is almost skewed 70 private, 30 state. And you see this on TV and written press. And even when we were there, we went to several newsstands and collected every single paper that we could just to see ourselves. I mean, we wanted to debunk all this stuff, or we wanted to find out if it was true or not. And even the front page of the paper when we were there said Padrino, which is the dude under Maduro, he's his defense minister or whatever, it said all the blood is on his hands. And it said the number of the deaths at that time was 45 is on your hands. And what we realized after going to these protests and talking to a bunch of people who were peacefully protesting, and everyone's very free to talk about the government, pro and con, these guarimbas, it's a small contingent of protesters who are more anarchistic, but they're also very fascist, right-wing ideology, and they create a violent barricade, and this is happening all over the city. It shuts down life in Caracas, and they're creating these violent barricades that then the state forces react to them. And so that's where you see this death toll, 90 dead. Half of the deaths have actually been caused directly.
More than half.
More than half. Way more than half.
Over 60, yeah.
23 deaths have been by security forces on protesters. All the rest of them have been people getting either executed by opposition, burned alive. There's been 4 cases of people actually getting burned alive where they said, "Are you a Chavista?" And they throw a Molotov cocktail on them and they get burned alive. Wow. And someone actually just died. Orlando Figuera, it's really horrific, the kind of violence that's going on the ground. But yeah, over half the deaths have been caused directly by these people, either the flaming barricades, cars trying to escape. We were on the front lines of these barricades and we saw the chaos that unfolds when they douse an incendiary liquid on a freeway and commandeer a truck, an 18-wheeler, and pull people out and maneuver these trucks on the freeway and create these flaming barricades.
And then no one gets arrested.
And there was no arrests when we were there. And we were just like, wow, what a crazy contrast to the 200 plus people who are facing life in prison in the US for a broken fucking window in the inauguration. They're facing life in jail, including journalists. But that's a totalitarian dictatorship, and the US is the freest country in the world.
Yeah, they're definitely mischaracterizing the opposition movement as this freedom fighters who are just being repressed for exercising rights, when it's actually an extreme degree of violence on a regular basis. I mean, mob lynchings of people who are identified as Chavistas, meaning that they're socialists, they're progressives, they want to get rid of the class divide and things like that. They're being targeted for those reasons. I mean, the things that they're attacking are free clinics run by Cuba. They're trying to burn those down. They're attacking maternity wards. For the fact that the main demand of the opposition or the complaint of the opposition is food scarcity, yet they just burned 50 tons of food in a warehouse that was meant to be distributed to poor areas. So completely contradictory when you look at what they're doing and what's being said about them. So it's mischaracterizing them, but also they want to create this image that the people of Venezuela are predominantly against the government, or apathetic or bought off or whatever. And I think that one of the greatest things for me that I experienced is just seeing the high degree of political consciousness there. I mean, millions and millions of people who are people that we would identify with. Progressive people, socialist people, revolutionary-minded people, people that want to create an equal society, that think that we have enough abundance to be able to care for everyone, provide everyone healthcare, things like that. They're they have state power, and they are so actively participating in this process. I mean, the Constitution they have was created in a mass democratic way, where you meet people in poor neighborhoods who literally wrote lines that got in the Constitution and then was voted on by everyone and then studied collectively by everyone and things like that. And so while we see that there's a big opposition movement in the streets that's burning a lot of stuff down and fighting with the police and things like that, there are millions of people who are engaged in a different way, engaged in trying to combat the economic war, build more democracy, build more institutions of communal power and people's power. And so that's, I think, why we should support the Bolivarian Revolution, because it's this organic process that they're going through of heading towards trying to create a more equal society and battling the forces of reaction that, want to take back what they once had.
And another really interesting facet is the nature of the opposition leaders. Like, if you saw people in the streets here burning shit down, burning government, and they even tried to burn down the Supreme Court, for Christ's sake. I mean, these people would be executed, right? Let's face it. But the Western media not only paints these people as heroes and all that, but the opposition leaders in Venezuela do not denounce this violence. In fact, they encourage it. You see Capriles, you see Lopez actually out there saying, time is now, take up arms, let's go. So it's encouraged, it's not castigated whatsoever by the leaders, and that's what's so disturbing. They say they want peace, but then when you look at what the opposition's plan is, it almost could turn into a very disturbing, like Pinochet-style dictatorship, where what would they do if they took back power? Right. Because, the only things that we know about the opposition is kind of leaked plans that came out of another 2014 coup attempt where they were going to bomb the Telesur studios and all this stuff. But what came out of this plan was saying that they would immediately privatize the 1.6 million Mission Vivienda homes, which has been, nationalized by the government and given away to poor people. They would immediately privatize those homes. They would immediately oust the government, and they would immediately free all political prisoners, which is really people who were involved in overt coup attempts over the last 15 years.
And privatize the oil.
It's like so it's like, well, what? So it's nothing about like how would we save the economy?
Yeah.
It's just like immediate privatization of all these things, and then you realize a lot of the nuances of economic sabotage. You mentioned austerity, Peter. Look, Venezuela has a lot of problems, and this is a lot of problems with these kind of countries coming out of colonial subjugation for so long, is that they have I forget the name. There's a you probably know this. It's a name about the burden of like having oil, and having that raw material.
Monocrop economy.
Yeah.
Resource curse.
Yeah, the resource curse, and so you see Venezuela. Same with Ecuador. Same with a lot of these countries. When they went toward a more socialist path, they just did mass social programs and social spending without diversifying their economy, without building some sort of agricultural platform, knowing, first of all, oil can be devalued in a heartbeat. You have OPEC setting these standards, and you just have so many different things that could happen, especially the reliance on the US dollar. So there is a lot of fault, I think, for the government to not foresee the problems and know how much sabotage could really be incurred from the global capitalist market. But on the other hand, they have to rely on some of these things. And so, but I mean, the successes of the Bolivarian Revolution cannot be overstated. I mean, poverty, literacy, it's kind of the same monumental accomplishments as Cuba. It's astounding when you see what can be done when you invest in humanity.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to the mainstream media over in the different countries. Is it as sensationalized and propaganda-ish as America?
No,
well,
I mean, yeah.
Well, Abby's example of going to all the different newsstands and finding all these different newspapers. I mean, I forget what it was, but we got like 9 newspapers, and like 7 of them were like not only overtly anti-government, but had the craziest headlines. Like one of the headlines was "Trump must take care of Maduro." And this is so yes, this is a dictatorship that represses freedom of the media. These were the type of things you see kind of in popular culture there.
Yeah, and even on the news, one of the stations that their permit was not renewed in Venezuela was a station that they were just constantly saying, "Kill the president."
Right.
Kill the president. So.
It's on the ticker.
And also, the levels of violence here are going up. The congressman that was shot. I mean, I'm saying on the part of the left and the right. The congressman that was shot recently, and it's migrating here, and That's very scary when
it is.
violence becomes.
Violence.
Yeah, but we want to make sure not
which-
to conflate alt-right with this false notion of an alt-left, because really, I feel like that's what
Right,
the
good
mainstream is
point.
trying to do. They're trying to say like, oh, this guy was a Bernie Sanders supporter.
Oh, wow.
You know, and really that's just totally false. I mean, look, there's one side that's directly inciting like fascist violence, and the other side that's like, let's get healthcare. Like, there's no
Yeah.
comparison really of like inciting this.
Well, there will be more violence
Right.
because
There will be.
people's needs, psychologically, emotionally, physically as well, aren't being met, and that's what violence stems from.
And it's emboldened the right in these fascist forces,
Yep.
in addition to problems of society causing that anyway. This new emboldenment where fascist groups are skyrocketing now, even more so than under Obama, and we thought that was a huge increase. I mean, groups like the Three Percenters, Proud Boys, all these militias in states which are being like deputized by right-wing governors who are like super armed, like super fascist militias, and fascist violence is increasing, and so it's a really serious thing. But it's not just happening here. I mean, it's happening in all these other countries that are dealing with a global capitalist crisis. There's rising fascist movements all over the world, and we're seeing a similar thing here. It's just one of the contradictions of the
So
system.
unfortunate because it's the exact opposite of what's required.
Oh my God, yeah.
I try to be optimistic about things, and there's so much great potential out there. There really are great solutions if there can be that final psychological shift of intent, where people finally see that nothing will come from any form of separatist view. There has to be an integrated view, and there has to be a shared value system, and there has to be habitat coexistence.
Yeah.
And the more I think about it, the farther we seem to be getting from that. And you look at Venezuela; it was stable under Chavez. I mean, it had a very, it was poor, but it still had a high education, just like Cuba. I mean,
Or
look-
Brazil.
yeah,
They
sure.
just did a coup d'état in Brazil, a soft coup d'état in Brazil.
And I wanted to ask actually, I hadn't researched the the government that followed Chavez.
Maduro,
Was that actually influenced by U.S. forces and empire,
No.
or was that completely democratically elected?
Maduro.
Yeah, and he won by a small margin, but he won a democratic
And
election.
what were the policies that have sparked this outrage and the poverty and such, than the decrease in life standard of value?
Sure. I mean, so, what Venezuela, mostly dependent on oil. So they're doing a lot to try to, build up production in other avenues. But, when Chavez came into power, price of oil was high. It was high for many years. And so you're able to implement these massive social programs, really take so many people out of poverty, educate so many people, things like that. They're still doing that. Even though they've lost like 80% of their GDP from the drop in oil prices, they're still increasing social spending every year. So that's like a thing that's kind of hard to conceive of if you're like a capitalist-minded person. Like, oh, you're losing 80% of profits, but you're going to increase your social spending. But yeah, it's just like, dealing with this, they're connected to this global capitalist economy, so they're dealing with the crisis that's connected to it. And so,
Which, by the way, is astounding because the drop in oil prices should be celebrated. It should be a sign of abundance,
Yeah,
even though it's
right?
fake.
Yeah.
right.
It should be like, and instead,
It's a political movement.
it makes your mind spin when you look at the contradictions. Go on.
No, so the combination of having to deal with this anyway,
Yeah.
right? This global crisis, this legacy of colonialism and underdevelopment,
Right.
and then at the same time having all this U.S. influence and other right-wing countries that want to overthrow the progressive government, and also sabotage from within, from the capitalist forces within the country. When you have an economic crisis, the incumbent government is going to have a lot of problems and have a lot of anger from people, and a lot of it legitimate grievances and righteous anger about the situation that they're living in. And so these factors, led to the situation that there is now.
Yeah.
I think there's a great deal being done by the people and by we went to every neighborhood you go to, every poor neighborhood, people are actively engaged in solving the problems. It's not just like, oh, there's food scarcity, we support the government because they're going to give us more food, but we're not going to do anything, and the opposition is like, they're not doing enough and we don't like them. I mean, people, especially in the poor communities, are actively participating in so many ways on distributing food, growing more food, coming up with new ways of agriculture and things like that. So I think it's encouraging at very, many different reasons to why it's in the situation it is.
Brings
but-
us to the idea of solutions and what that implies. I was thinking recently about the story of Cuba, and even in a polarized sense, the story of North Korea. After the Korean War, you have two kind of similar phenomenons where nations by force or by their own will and ostracize, isolate themselves, in the sense of North Korea. In Cuba, what if that happened, say, 100 years from now, hypothetically, and they had high technology, and they're able to do more with less, because what's happened through technology is everything is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, and more democratized in the sense of how people can influence certain structures. What if Cuba didn't need to trade? What if, just in the same sense that North Korea doesn't need to trade, though it probably does, based on the little we know about it, but I'm not going to even go on that one since it's such an obscure nation. But Cuba is the best example. If it existed in a high technology future, and it was able to create an internal structure that was of its own social democratic interests without any imposition. This is the way I think things are going to have to happen in the future. I've given a lot of thought to it. I don't see, years ago I'd say, well, get enough galvanized people together and suddenly people will change their minds. And over the course of the past decade, I've thought about this and I've watched the social psychology, I've watched these in-group reactions. You see this ebb and flow that doesn't seem to have a rational bone at the moment anyway. The rationality is there, but it keeps getting dominated by these structural forces that incite fear and force people back into their caves and their groups, and then develop these ideologies that don't work. And I'm not aware of any nation on this planet, except for maybe the Scandinavian countries, which no one pays attention to, because they're the ones that have actually done things to help kids get off drugs. I just read a recent report where they did a real basic thing. They were able to cut by 80% all drug and alcohol use in teenagers by simply giving a sense of community, sport, and art. Arts and sports.
Wow.
Imagine that.
Unbelievable.
Very fundamental, I
Give
think.
him a paintbrush instead of a bomb.
Wow.
What genius came up with that?
As opposed to the United States that's cut
Wow.
all of its programs, well, except sports, of course. Right? But these weren't just antagonistic sports like football. There
Right,
were
right.
other creative things
The
that
right
were
to sport.
happening. I'm sorry?
Your points beg the question, can we reform the U.S. from within?
Or can we reform the world? Because it's not just the
Well,
U.S.
human nature.
Now, the U.S., human nature is not an issue of reform. It's an issue of figuring out how to amplify the positive as opposed to the negative. We have our lower reptilian brain that's being triggered with fight or flight and fear and those in-group limbic responses. But we do have the prefrontal cortex, which is our consciousness, which is what gives us judgment, which gives us pause, why we don't run around raping people all the time. There is that side of us that wants and can mature to that point.
I agree,
where
but-
we identify properly.
Until you have a population full of individuals who have been trained and properly grown, you have all these individuals walking around that are dominated by their limbic brain, who are reactionary.
Which comes from the structural imposition of the economy and the political structure, the belief systems, the cultural hegemony.
I agree.
And it's my thought process more than anything else as I work on new communicative ideas and films and stuff, is to how do I communicate all of these elements together? And I think the recipe for that is also what will subscribe the solution. And going back to this idea of a small pocket, it would seem to me that if it gets bad enough, especially over the next 2 generations, if all current trajectories stay the same. I mean, there are gainsayers out there, but they might as well be up there with the flat earthers, because there's very little positive stuff out there at all. I mean, I can't think of any singular positive trajectory that we were doing except the efficiency in technology.
Yep.
And there's a small subculture of completely blinded entrepreneurs that think, and the Bill Gates and so on, that think, this is going to be the trend that saves humanity and eliminates all poverty. It's just a myopic view. There are great strides we've made over the past 200 years, because that's what the Industrial Revolution did. It did create great abundance in systems and technology, and that enabled us to raise standard of living and so on and so forth, but also created these new inclinations of empire, these new patterns of dominance, new destructive patterns.
And it
All of our
doesn't
high
address-
sign, what's
yeah,
that?
it
And
doesn't
winners and
address-
losers.
Right, it doesn't address
Exactly,
the
and the social and the
psychological-
archaic jungle primitive societies still remains.
Yeah.
And that's what has to be changed structurally. And the question is it done by a large galvanization? The Zeitgeist Movement was created in the attempt, as hard as it is, to galvanize the world with a common value system. Over the past 10 years, I could say that certain seeds have been planted. Otherwise, mainstream phenomenon, mainstream society has gone off the rails. At the same time, I'm like, well, then maybe someone has to start something new. And that's it's not out of the question. I'm going to the extreme here. I'm fantasizing here. Let's assume there was a place that people could get off the grid from the entire effectively capitalist trade agreement world.
I do think there are experiments with alternative cultures, not gigantic nationwide experiments, but there are experiments with alternative culture of people living in the old way that isn't so technologically bound, sure, but also isn't driven by capitalist concerns.
But also the trends now are really important to look at. Like Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, we've been told by this government and by the system forever that going more left, I mean, look at it, it's just gone more to the right, an inch closer to the right ever since the beginning of this country. And so politically, we've been neutered. You know, progressivism is dead. There's no representation for revolutionary thought in the system, and so it's been crushed repeatedly. And they've just said, you know, like Nancy Pelosi, that famous clip of her being like, "We're capitalists, okay, and that's just the way it is."
That was the
like,
one where someone commented.
Like someone's like, "What about taking a more like, you know, like
well, I think what
rational approach?"
was like a 51% of millennials now believe in socialism.
That's what I was going to say. So the trend in America is changing for the first time. I mean, anti-communism has defined this country for as long as it's existed. You know, since whatever, and crush the working class, crush the left. And so to have in a country that is indoctrinated so hard about that mentality, to actually have people think that capitalism is bad, that's amazing. And that's hugely hopeful. And then to see Jeremy Corbyn, who is actually a revolutionary figure, not like a Bernie Sanders, you know, who doesn't touch imperialism, he is the real deal in that sense. And to see him actually that close to winning prime minister, I think is really inspiring.
Trudeau,
Good.
also
He is more of a neoliberal character. Yeah. Jeremy Corbyn's like, I'm going to prosecute Blair for war crimes. It's just like,
But you know what's interesting?
he's
Going back,
hard.
I went back and did the history of political debate in America, and I wanted to see what they were talking about. What were the first recorded debates, and what were the subjects? It's the exact same subjects you hear about today.
Wow.
No way.
It is. It's poverty. It's the interference of business. It's government corruption. Basically nothing's really changed. And when I hear about that's unfortunately the caveat I hear. Like even with Sanders, if Sanders was elected, I think that certain positive reforms would have occurred, but he would have gone up against, you know, a force that he would have had to have heeded to. Maybe we would have gotten a single-payer health plan and so on, but it still wouldn't have stopped. So the structure, it can't necessarily be of a political nature. The structural reform can't necessarily be of a political nature. So then the question is, how do you educate people on the economic underpinnings? I think politics is just economics by another means, just as war is politics by another means. So therein lies the great educational incapacity. You know, I've meet people that, you know, like saw my first film and blah, 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 sensational, and then I start to talk about economics, they glaze over because their conception of it, no one's been taught it. It's probably the greatest covert form of ignorance.
Yeah, there's a lot of fear around it too, and your brain can't even function properly when you're in a
Because
state of
it's
fear.
so intimidating because it's not supposed to make sense when you're taught it. It doesn't. It doesn't make any sense.
We've hit on the ultimate.
Hands are involved.
We've hit on the ultimate solution, which is education. And you mentioned the millennials. I do have some faith. I teach young people, and I do have some faith, a modicum of faith. And they are a little different, and I hope that continues. I mean, we saw the '60s generation get drawn in materialism, so it can happen. But education, providing new information is really our best hope.
And I think the chicken and egg problem is that there's always going to be structural incentives. So you could educate people, like we've all been educated, we have different value systems than the majority, but we're stuck fighting incentives that go against what we believe. And we're always compromising ourselves in some way. If I'm in contract for some kind of editing gig or an animation gig or something, I have to turn into a capitalist Machiavellian douchebag for a brief moment because I know the other person's going to be a capitalist Machiavellian douchebag too. And it just sucks so badly because it does something to your subconscious. And that goes back to the whole phenomenon of the in-group, out-group fear and this fascist reconstruction, not even reconstruction, it's always been there, it's just been a little bit more dormant in America. And the fight and the need to win, and the dominance.
You need to brand yourself and be like, it's about
to be
this
rewarded,
brand.
Which millennials are completely into.
It's horrible.
The need to self-promote.
Especially in the internet age.
Oh, God.
No, the internet age brings a whole new level to it. But it makes that problem that much more visceral. Like there's so many forces. If you were to chart it all out and look at the value system, what needs to be done, and then everything else that's opposed to on a psychological, sociological, and even biological level, it's a daunting thing to consider, but it has to be considered. I'm sorry?
No. It was getting really interesting there when you were speaking about opportunities so we have these small countries, Scandinavian countries, they're doing things a lot better than we are. That's a large population or portion of the world that that are making progress, and opportunities in places like Cuba, they do have an opportunity to function completely independently.
Sort of.
If something like that could happen.
If they had, in the sense if they could get on their own, if they were off the grid.
Exactly.
There's a great film about how Cuba survived, and I guess it was in the 90s when the Soviet Union basically cut off oil supply. And they, all of a sudden, all these vehicles they had they couldn't run because they didn't have oil, and of course they were still under embargo. And they started planting gardens in the backyards, and they ran on what they could on electric and so on and so forth. And there's a great film, I think it's called How Cuba Survived the Oil Crunch or something like that. It's a very good film about how they banded together as a people, knuckled up, and you had doctors digging in the growing food just as well as cabbies and gardeners.
And then going back to empire, though, what happens when any of these countries try to do something different? Well, the
Dagger to
bully,
their throat.
the bully in the room.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's just so heartbreaking because the stranglehold that the U.S. has and continues to have and seems to be only growing, even if it does become an economically weak power, its military power is so extreme. It can make money out of nothing. It holds the U.S. dollar, it holds the oil reserve dollar, and it can pretty much do whatever it wants. And any country that tries to step out, it feels that force.
Yep.
And the question is, how the hell do you stop this macro force like that? Because it's beyond, as I said earlier, it's beyond just the incentives of this underlying structuralism. It's beyond the self-interest in itself. Now it's just straight dominance. And the question is, what do we do?
Media literacy. And when I watched the Zeitgeist trilogy, I mean, it helped me, Peter. That's why, I mean, it helped inspire me to do media. So we don't know the impact that we have and the information that we put out and the snowball effect that can have. And it really cannot be understated how important it is to have critical thinking skills, the ability to respond, right? The word responsibility, not just reacting to facts and putting out a fucking video and I want to say something about this before I know anything about it. It's like, why are you flooding more content into the consciousness of society? We need to take the information, try to analyze it, understand how to responsibly react to it and engage and benefit the dialogue. And also just, of course, linking up with like minds in your community to achieve these things.
Becoming active participants in the struggle. I mean, I think the Democratic Party now, much like they did under Nixon, right? Under Nixon, there was mass social movements, right? Against racism, against war, against poverty. And the Democrats use this Nixon Watergate scandal to kind of try to funnel all of that into this hope that we can impeach the president over this stupid little thing that he did. Similar things happening now. I mean, Trump, this is why most of the ruling class didn't want Trump. All the Fortune 500 CEOs were like, we're donating to Hillary Clinton. None of them donated to Trump because they knew he would be a magnet for struggle and for resistance. And so once that happened, once that was triggered, the Democratic Party has tried to use this Russia crap to try to divert all of this new movement that's been born under Trump into be like, well, maybe we can get him impeached over this Russia connection, and then they want to, hijack the struggle into that. So I think that and so I think like what the solution is, there's many directions we can go with that, but it's becoming that participant in the struggle. And I think that just in the past several months, I mean, the May Day demonstrations here in LA, I mean, 200,000 people coming out against Trump's immigration policy.
Today.
Right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Pride March. I mean, there is, instead of a Pride parade in LA this year, there was a Pride resistance march, where there's, over 200,000 people marching through Hollywood against, what's going to come from the Trump administration. So I think those are the examples of what can change things. I mean, mass people's power.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we need to be there so we can guide people in the right direction. A lot of these people are very new politically. I mean, it takes years to really have a comprehensive political understanding of how the world works and how empire works and what the solution is. And so these people who are coming out new, being revolted by Trump, I mean, we need to be there to guide them and help their understanding. So.
Well, we're going to have to wrap this up soon, but on the comment of media, one of the great, problematic contradictions, I guess you could call it, or distractions, is that since media is run for money, hence, again, the election of Trump, because he got ratings. He got billions of dollars generated through ad revenue just because he's just a clown. You have this phenomenon where there's just a saturation. People don't know what to do anymore. Back in the day, you'd have like a newspaper thrown at your door. Very easy to control media, but at least you could read it all. But now it's like this bombardment because everyone's out there at once trying to throw things at you to get you to pay attention to them, and that doesn't help anything at this point either. As opposed to the Empire Files, which is an excellent series. I hope it keeps going. You're in second season now?
Yes.
That's great.
And what we try to do is, history is obviously written by the winners. It's written by men. We're trying to retell the lost chapters of American history, the empire, how it's affected the rest of the world with militarism and capitalism through the eyes of the marginalized and oppressed who have been completely obscured from history books, and retell those stories, empower those voices, and understand how much that has to do with the way society works today, is those struggles, those revolutionaries, those leaders, those activists.
Yeah, and understanding how it all connects to the fact that the United States is the biggest empire ever in human history, and every problem in the world and in our own country can be connected to the existence of that as the overall system that we live under. And so people can go to theempirefiles.tv to check out the website and videos, tell us we're English on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook and all that stuff. But we're coming out now with, Abby did so much amazing on-the-ground coverage in Venezuela, interviews with people that will inform people a lot more about some of the things we talked about today. So that's coming up, and of course, touching many other, diverse range of topics, both international and domestic.
Which I think is excellent.
Yeah, very well written.
We wear our heart on our sleeves. I mean, we don't, objectivity is bullshit in this day and age.
Yes.
And obviously, these people who we have to show what Monsanto says. So when we talk about GMOs, it's like we just, it's very obvious where we stand, and that's what's not heard.
Mm-hmm. It's really helped me comb through the mess of everything globally that I've been struggling to understand because it's so complex. I feel like you guys have broken it down issue by issue, and you've just laid out facts in a very it makes you emotional to see the facts, but you guys have laid it out in a very non-emotional way that helps understand it.
Just taking a cue from Peter.
Oh.
Just doing my best. Just doing my best.
So to sum up the solution, I think it's education and
Yes.
complete
Especially at this,
exfoliation of about 2 layers of dead skin currently in control.
And
I
engagement.
think it's also creating the alternative.
Yes.
Not reforming the system, because you're never going to.
Oh, yes.
It's creating an alternative, having it succeed, and having people going, hey, I want to be a part of that, not a part of this
just
movement.
make
Exactly.
the current system
Exactly.
obsolete, like Buckminster Fuller says.
Exactly.
That's a Bucky.
We're trapped in a divide and conquer reality, whether intended or not. And the more people stay divided, the more they will be conquered. And until we get history understood, the present understood, until we can infer the proper solutions, we're doomed.
Link up to your local Zeitgeist chapter. Link up to your local. It's all about the community building. It's all about the community building. There's
Yeah, we had our. It is about community
goes
building.
blank and someone at home freaks out. Oh my
Also,
Yes, I was just going to say really quickly, even someone like, in a podunk town in like Montana or whatever, like I'll have people reach out to me and they're like, oh man, I wish that I lived in a big city. And it's like, just start a meetup group. I mean, that's how I started. I literally started a
Meetups
meetup
are
group, and then I
powerful.
ended up having 250 members, and I still am good friends with those people today, and I don't know what I would do if I didn't take that initiative. And I think that people just need to take the initiative. Don't be scared. We are so disempowered by the system.
Yes.
We feel like we cannot change anything. That is fucking bullshit.
yeah.
Just like Jack Fresco said, if you think that you can't change the world, that just means you're not going to be the person who will.
Right, exactly.
And that adds to what my other element of solution would be: get involved in local politics. Everyone always thinks everyone tends to think about the president, but
Got to do everything.
Everything.
Involved. Even if it's not politics, if you don't want to run for office, get involved locally.
And keep in mind, a lot is happening right now. There could be small things happening that we can't see right now that are catalysts for huge change.
Exactly.
It's very
Sure.
exciting. The possibilities are there, and there's a lot of possibilities.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right. So, Summer Perry, thank you.
Yeah.
Mike Prysner.
Yeah.
Michael Jordet. The great Abby Martin. And Rob Dew. How are you? Thank you guys for doing this.
Peter Joseph! Woo!
And
That was
this
great.
has been In All Seriousness. And if anyone wants to support what we're doing, the zeitgeistmovement.com. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so that link is there as well. And we'll be putting out these podcasts as often as we can. Thank you all for listening, and thank you all for joining me. Me? Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Abby and Mike, for coming.
Yeah,
Yay, that was
Our
really,
pleasure.
really
Thank you.
Awesome. It could have gone
fun.
forever.
Yeah, it was super. What a great format.